On July 30th, 1619, 31 men met in a wooden church in Jamestown, Virginia. It was a small building, 20 by 50 feet, and the inside sweltered in the subtropical summer heat and humidity. A prayer was said by the minister, quote, that it would please God to guide and sanctify all our proceedings to his own glory and the good of this plantation. The men then swore an oath of supremacy, affirming that the king was supreme governor of the Church of England, a test to weed out any possible crypto-Catholics. And with the formalities out of the way, it was time to get to work. This was the first meeting of Virginia's General Assembly, the first legislative body in British America. It was also notable for its membership. Some of the men were appointees, but a large majority had been elected by the free men of the colony. This was something new too. The colonists of Virginia were now being called on to govern themselves. Or at least some of the colonists were being called on to govern themselves somewhat. This first assembly was brief, lasting only 6 days before dispersing. The unhealthy climate cut things short. Several members fell ill, and one even died during that short period. But the General Assembly would meet again the next year, and the year after that, and the year after that. It was by no means democratic or fully representative, but it was still an important precedent. Elections were here to stay. Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the History of Elections in America. Episode 3, Legislatures, East and West. Last time, we talked about the first few years of Jamestown, Virginia. Despite the new colony's repeated disasters, within a decade or so it was starting to find a workable model for its existence. Tobacco became the main export, and tobacco plantations shaped the economic life of Virginia. Politically, the colony exited martial law and gained its own elected assembly. It's that assembly that I'm going to focus on today. But first I need to jump back in time a little bit. Actually, a lot of bit. 4 centuries. And bring you up to speed on the history of the English Parliament and what it was like during the early 1600s. The English and American models of government are going to wind up diverging a lot, but they spring from the same sources. As we'll see, Parliament as an institution was changing rapidly during these early decades of colonization, becoming more representative and more combative. So Americans didn't simply inherit fixed institutions. Both England and America were developing a new political awareness around the same time, and so the solutions both sides came up with wound up being markedly different. The origins of Parliament are somewhat murky. It had no particular beginning, no single moment that we can point to. Instead, it developed over time, beginning around the early 1200s. This was the age of Thomas Aquinas, of the Mongol invasions, of when the last Crusader states were slowly being pushed out of the Middle East. During this time, the king would hold occasional assemblies with the notables of the realm, the lords and bishops and so on. Kings found it useful to hear complaints, to gauge the moods of their most important subjects, to secure consensus for action, that sort of thing. These assemblies were at first irregular and informal. They had no fixed role or regular schedule or anything like that. They were often called parliaments, but they certainly weren't anything like what we think of when we think of parliament today. In fact, many other states in Western Europe had similar parliaments at this stage, but the English one would develop in a peculiar way. You see, during this time there were a number of revolts by the barons against the monarchy in England. Most famously, in 1215, King John was forced to sign Magna Carta, a document granting his subjects various rights, which is often seen as the real beginning of constitutional law in England. Well, a few decades later, in the 1250s, there was another revolt, this time against Henry III. Henry was forced to sign what were called the Provisions of Oxford. Importantly for us, the Provisions of Oxford called for regular parliaments to redress abuses that would otherwise go unchecked. Although the king would win the next war against his barons, which enabled him to repudiate that agreement, the idea of using regular parliaments as a way to check governmental abuses continued. Soon they gained at least some legislative and judicial functions. Parliament was now an official thing. Of course, these early parliaments had little in the way of popular representation, but it wasn't just the aristocracy who attended, even if they were dominant. Even from this early stage, cities and towns were generally entitled to send representatives. However, in the beginning, Much like in Virginia in a few centuries, there were no separate upper and lower houses. That only came in 1341, under Edward III. Because the interests of the lords and everyone else had diverged so much, it was thought best that they meet and work apart from one another. So, Parliament was divided into the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Now, there was a separate body within Parliament, which represented interests outside of those of the nobility, and which couldn't just be ignored, though its power grew slowly. During the 1300s, the century of the Black Death, Parliament and the House of Commons became more self-conscious, assertive, and formalized. Parliament could even organize the defense of the realm in the king's absence. Most importantly, Parliament's approval for new taxes became a necessity. So if, say, the king needed to pay for a war, the Commons might delay providing funds until they had exacted a promise to soften some hated law or remove some corrupt officials. Though they were hesitant to undermine the will of the monarch entirely, they were gradually more and more willing to use their prerogatives to at least make sure that their complaints were heard. Still, there was little in the way of total opposition to the monarchy, nor were there any political parties. The next 2 centuries saw the major upheavals of the Wars of the Roses and the Reformation, but little further in the way of parliamentary development that we need to be concerned with. Although in 1430 a law was passed outlining basic election procedures and restricting the franchise in rural areas to men who held so-called 40-shilling freeholds. That is, land worth 40 shillings a year in rent, which was not an especially high amount. The restrictions on urban voting were a little more varied. So that brings us to the early 1600s. This was of course the start of English colonization in the Americas, but it was also a time of great ferment in England itself. Political and economic power were being centralized by kings across Europe. Think Louis XIV in France building Versailles in the second half of the century. In England there was a similar trend, and the monarchy found itself needing more and more revenue. Some money they raised by granting monopolies, as I mentioned last time. But mostly, they needed new taxes, and that required parliamentary approval. This both threatened Parliament and enhanced its importance. Enhanced because it was now becoming more politically central. Threatened because of course the kings were none too happy with having to grovel for funds, and so were looking for ways to bypass Parliament altogether and rule on their own. For instance, Charles I didn't call a Parliament for all of the 1630s, and only relented in the face of bankruptcy. So the increasing assertiveness of the monarchy led to the increasing assertiveness of Parliament. In fact, Charles's refusal to call a Parliament led pretty directly to the English Civil War, in which Parliament had Charles executed and temporarily overthrew the monarchy altogether. But we'll get to that in later episodes. This parliamentary assertiveness was backed by a new ideological understanding of the role of the House of Commons. The fact that the Commons was elected by the people, or at least by some of the people, was now understood to give it a source of legitimacy separate from that of the king. And since the government was now demanding more from the people, it was only right that the people should demand more from their government. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," hadn't yet been coined, but you can sense the underlying idea start to germinate. None of this was explicitly thought out or theorized yet. Nobody was talking about social contracts or the will of the people. But the people were becoming a political force of their own. And over time the electorate had been growing, though as much by chance as by planning. For one thing, that 40-shilling freehold requirement was becoming less meaningful over time thanks to inflation, and may not have been strictly enforced anyway. New voting districts were created, and in the towns the franchise was slowly expanded as one faction or another tried to broaden its base of support. According to Derek Hurst in his book, The Representative of the People, Voters and Voting in England Under the Early Stuarts, around 1640, the electorate may have totaled 300,000 people out of a population of 4.5 million. That's about 30 to 40% of all adult males. Tremendously high, at least for the time. Parliament couldn't be said to represent the whole nation, but it definitely had a sizable constituency to give it legitimacy. Of course, suffrage in America was even wider. Additionally, more elections were being openly contested than during the Elizabethan era. Parliament was becoming more important and more prestigious, so there was more of a reason to run. And it didn't take long for candidates to learn to distinguish themselves from their rivals by promoting different policies and different ideas. So not only could a lot of people vote, they had something to vote for. All of these changes, taken together, fostered something of a national political awareness among the people. Which isn't to say that voters decided based on national issues. Elections, even to Parliament, were mostly about local grievances like class conflicts among the ruling oligarchies in towns or following the will of your landlord. But voters were becoming empowered and aware that their representatives could shape policy to their benefit. Elections at this time were still quite primitive and informal by modern standards, though. The principle of majority rule wasn't even totally accepted yet, with some gentry arguing that their votes should somehow count for more than those of the common rabble. There were secret ballots in some jurisdictions, but voting was often done simply by the cry or the view, that is, out loud or by a show of hands. Hence, elections could be manipulated by the more notable men of the region, although not too reliably. Practices like systematic bribery hadn't really developed yet. Even the cheating was primitive. Nobody had totally thought through the importance of elections. By the end of this period, 1640 or so, voters were even becoming aware of the importance of national political issues and were finally looking beyond their local grievances when electing members of Parliament. Over time, Parliament came to be divided into two rough factions: court, consisting of those generally supportive of the king, and country, consisting of those generally opposed to him. These weren't modern political parties or anything, just loose affiliations. A candidate's ties to the court could help or hinder him depending on the political situation, but it wasn't an overwhelming factor in his success. So, in the first few decades of the 1600s, the decades when the first American colonies were being founded, the House of Commons in England was just starting to become something like a modern legislature. At the very least, many of the pieces were in place. A broad electorate was voting in contested elections for candidates who themselves represented proto-parties. Plus, there was a sense that elections themselves conferred some nebulous legitimacy. So it's hardly surprising that English colonists would look to replicate these institutions in their new homes. They were, after all, self-consciously Englishmen who had been explicitly granted the rights of Englishmen by the king. It's also not surprising that the English and American styles of representative government would in the end diverge so widely. America began creating its own institutions and norms well before the institutions and norms in England had themselves coagulated into stable forms. American governments weren't closed to outside influences, but they were their own thing from the beginning. So with that out of the way, let's return to Virginia in 1618. You'll recall that the last episode ended with the creation of a General Assembly for Virginia. Now I'd like to go back and talk a bit more about its founding, with the example of Parliament in mind. As you may have guessed from everything I've just been saying, the creation of the General Assembly was not due to high-minded notions of representation or anything like that. After all, those sorts of ideas hadn't yet been fully developed, so they could hardly serve as an ideal for Virginia. Nor was the General Assembly created due to any particular pressure from the colonists there. They were too busy trying to grow tobacco without dying horribly. And in fact, I think you could say that it was a pretty premature move in a lot of ways. The population was still small. The population was still unstable, requiring constant replacement. Not great for democracy. So why did it happen? Well, this new system was the brainchild of Edwin Sandys, who was a prominent executive in the Virginia Company back in England. Remember, Virginia was being run privately. Sandys, incidentally, was also a member of Parliament, and a general supporter of free elections and expanding the franchise within England. But whether or not he had any idealistic notions when coming up with the General Assembly, we'll never know. What we do know is that there were straightforward, pragmatic reasons. Firstly, he wanted to change Virginia's bad reputation for mismanagement and harsh government. That would hopefully entice more colonists and thus help the company financially. Secondly, local governance just made more sense when communications with England could take months. That is, Sandys didn't just want government to seem better, he wanted it to actually be better. Under this new charter, the governor, still appointed back in England, and several councillors, also appointed, were to form a council of state, an executive/judicial body that took care of the real business of running things. Most of the senior administrators were councillors. Councillors served for life, but could be removed by the governor with cause. The governor was also to summon a General Assembly once a year or more if some emergency demanded it. The governor and councillors would be members, but in addition to them, each of the colony's little administrative units, towns, plantations, and hundreds, were to send 2 representatives each. The 100 meant a county, more or less. These representatives were the burgesses, burgess simply being an old word for elected official. In time, the burgesses would split off from the General Assembly and form the House of Burgesses. But at the start, both the elected and appointed officials all met as one body, much like Parliament centuries before. This was actually a quite common pattern in colonial America. An original unicameral assembly with both appointed and elected members would eventually split into an upper and lower house, since the two groups representing different constituencies had such different interests. The elected officials were a majority of the assembly, but their decisions could be overridden by the governor or other appointed officials. The assembly as a whole did have to approve all taxes. Even more men were given the vote than in England. The exact requirements aren't clear to us today, and they probably weren't too clear at the time either. Like in England, elections still had an element of informality to them. We know that all free men could vote, that is, all men who weren't servants. According to the instructions given for an election in 1623, officials were, quote, to assemble all the free men inhabiting in those plantations under your command, and by plurality of voices, to make election of 2 men that shall be thought sufficient and willing, and requiring the persons so chosen to give their attendance at James City. It's less clear whether or not indentured servants could vote. A few decades later, a law was passed explicitly banning servants from doing so, so it's quite possible that they had been voting at some point, maybe legally, maybe not. If they did, it was likely uncommon. There weren't really any slaves in Virginia yet, so they wouldn't have been considered one way or the other. I'm not sure whether or not this was made explicit at the time, but in general the voting age in England and later in the colonies was 21. That women couldn't vote was such an ingrained belief that it didn't need to be legally specified until 1762, a century and a half later. And in those instructions we also hear that in Virginia, much as in England, voting wasn't secret. Instead, the decisions were made through voice votes or shows of hands. So we can again assume that the more powerful men in a given community in fact had a say in who was chosen. Each constituency was to elect 2 men rather than 1. This is how things were done in England at the time as well. 2 officials were elected and men had 2 votes each. This was, all in all, a pretty radically democratic way of doing things, for the time. And it didn't have to be this way. It would have been easy, maybe even easier, to make smaller changes to make the colony more livable. I think that in the end you'd have elected legislatures either way, but it's still pretty remarkable. Also remarkable is that apparently there were no major objections to it at the time. Perhaps everybody's minds were on other matters. Perhaps they correctly figured that the powers of the burgesses were in fact reasonably limited. Whatever the case, the creation of the General Assembly meant that elections would be a regular feature of American life from the very earliest days. It wasn't at all a democracy, but it was, in some ways, democratic. With this new system of government agreed to by the Virginia Company, new instructions were drawn up and given to the new governor, Sir George Yeardley, a survivor of the wreck of the Sea Venture off Bermuda, and a previous deputy governor of the colony. Yeardley sailed back to Virginia in January 1619, carrying with him the document that would come to be known, perhaps a little ostentatiously, as the Great Charter. The records from this time don't all survive, but we can safely assume that sometime in the middle of 1619, Yeardley ordered that elections be held in accordance with his orders from the company. The free men from across the various towns and plantations of Virginia assembled in their small numbers and made their voices heard. They elected 22 men to serve, though the burgesses from one district weren't allowed to take their seats due to some irregularities in the legal status of their plantation. We do have one interesting record about those Polish craftsmen in Jamestown during the election, which states that, quote, upon some dispute of the Polonians resident in Virginia, it was now agreed, notwithstanding any former order to the contrary, that they shall be enfranchised, and made as free as any inhabitant there whatsoever. That dispute may have been something along the lines of a brief strike by the Polish in order to ensure their equal political rights alongside the English. In exchange, the Poles agreed to take on some more English apprentices. An interesting sidebar, showing that the right to vote was already being contested during literally the first real election. The burgesses met with the governor and 6 appointed councilmen in Jamestown on July 30th, 1619. We don't know very much about who the burgesses were, presumably mostly men who had been middling sorts back home but who had done well for themselves in Virginia and were respected by their peers. Of the councilmen, we know more. One was John Rolfe, who you'll remember married Pocahontas and introduced tobacco farming. Another, John Porey, had also previously served in the House of Commons. It's thanks to him that we have a record of this first assembly. It's also thanks to him that the General Assembly was run like a mini parliament, with similar rules, and the creation of committees to handle specific issues and so on. Things weren't exactly the same, there wasn't enough manpower for that, but they were close enough. So what sort of things did the First General Assembly of Virginia deal with? They went over their new charter, looking for any changes they might recommend to England. They passed laws against idleness and disturbing the peace with the Indians, laws regulating agriculture and fixing the price of tobacco. They made it illegal to sell good dog breeds to the Indians. They came up with petitions to send back to England, dealing with land rights, taxation, and the sending of more colonists. They dealt with some complaints against individuals, since, like Parliament, the Assembly also had some judicial functions. It was still acting as both legislature and court. Based on the records, it looks like these complaints were basically just members of the Assembly bringing up minor personal grievances they wanted the government to deal with. For instance, John Rolfe wanted them to censure another planter who had sent him a letter he found insulting and insolent. This pattern of obvious bias would continue. One councilman was at the meeting that ordered the execution of a man for the killing of a calf that belonged to him. This sort of what we would think of as straightforward corruption wasn't going away anytime soon, and I think that's important to keep in mind going forward. But overall, the Assembly's first meeting was pretty much what you'd expect for a fledgling colony, and it produced a surprisingly large output for only 6 days of work. The proceedings of the Assembly were forwarded to London, where Edwin Sandys, quote, found them in their greatest part to be very well and judiciously carried and performed. Unfortunately, we don't have much in the way of records for the next few assemblies in the following years, though there is no reason to doubt that they were being held. We know that in 1621 the General Assembly passed a law encouraging farmers to diversify away from tobacco, and another to contribute to, quote, the building of a house of entertainment in Jamestown, though I'm not quite sure what a house of entertainment actually meant at the time. Presumably they mostly just did normal government things. But we do know that as these early assemblies met and tried to keep their fledgling colony on the right track, something much more important and threatening was happening outside of the settlements. The arrival of more and more Europeans to Virginia had given the English enough manpower and firepower to push back the Indians and free the settlers from being at their mercy. But while the Indians had been made quiescent for the time being, they hadn't gone away. The old chief of the Powhatan had gradually lost prestige in the face of the onslaught and had been replaced by his more aggressive brother after his death. But the new leader bided his time. He knew that he was in a difficult position. So he waited for years, planning and building support. Until finally, on the morning of March 22nd, 1622, he struck. The Indians had been trading with the Europeans for a while, so it was easy for them to approach the settlements without arousing any suspicion. Warriors simply walked in under friendly pretenses, and without warning started to slaughter every colonist they could find. And the settlements were by now quite spread out, so it was impossible to warn the others in time to save them. A young Indian convert to Christianity did get warning to the capital at Jamestown, but most plantations were caught totally off guard. In a single day, a third of the colony's population was wiped out. Almost 350 men, women, and children were killed. This act, of course, shocked the colony into another war, and of course the English again in the end prevailed. They were ruthless. In one incident, one of the colony's doctors poisoned and killed 200 Indians at a supposed peace ceremony. Not too Hippocratic. But for our story, the most important impact of the massacre was back in England. It was becoming clear that the Virginia Company was not up to the task of running Virginia. Things had improved from the early years, but that wasn't saying much. The Virginia Company was sending new batches of colonists at the wrong times of year, needlessly increasing the death rate. Attempts to diversify the colony's economy beyond tobacco had failed utterly. Settlements were scattered haphazardly and thoughtlessly, making them more vulnerable to attack. And it still wasn't making money. So the massacre was really the last straw. After some legal wrangling on May 24th, 1624, the colony's royal charter was revoked. King James took over the colony himself, directly administering it as a royal province. The Virginia Company was done. It had lasted just 18 very troubled years. Neither it nor its investors would ever really profit from the endeavor. They had sent literally thousands of men, women, and children to their deaths on a raft of lies with nothing to show for it. Virginia survived and eventually flourished. The Virginia Company did not. But, moving along, what sort of changes in government did the shift to a royal colony entail? In late 1623, when it became clear that the Virginia Company was on its way out, the Privy Council back in England, that is the King's senior advisors, sent a commission to Virginia to survey the situation. They met with the General Assembly, who feared a return to the bad old days. They strongly asked the commission both that the Assembly be retained and that the future governors not be allowed to pass new taxes without the Assembly's approval. Exactly the same sort of concerns that we saw in England around the same time. Of course, even more important to the colonists than self-rule were economic concerns. They wanted their land protected and their tobacco bought. It looked like things wouldn't go the Virginians' way, however. It looked like the king was going to get rid of the Assembly. But shortly after the return of the commission to England, James I died, after 22 years on the English throne and 57 years on the Scottish one. He was succeeded in both realms by his generally less able son, Charles I, who confirmed that Virginia would remain a royal colony. He also declined to authorize further meetings of the General Assembly. However, he also didn't explicitly ban them. So the governor, now Sir Francis Wyatt, called a not-quite General Assembly. Wyatt had no right to do so, so this was an informal and dubious move. But elections were held, presumably the same as before, and the Not Assembly, styling itself the, quote, Governor, Council, and Colony of Virginia assembled together, met. Here's another precedent for those of you keeping count at home. The first, debatably legal elected assembly called to oppose policies by the mother country. The Not Assembly sent a number of petitions to King Charles, some of which were received favorably. But no action was taken to restore the right of the General Assembly to exist, or even for Virginians to hold assemblies under special circumstances. Instead, decisions were to be made by the governor, along with the majority of the council. So for a number of years, the General Assembly was essentially defunct. A few conventions were specially authorized to discuss specific issues in 1628 and 1629, but that was it. The brief experiment in American self-rule was at an end after only 5 years of elections. Or maybe not, because in 1629, without any formal approval from anyone, the Virginians just went ahead and voted in a new assembly, and then again in 1630 and 1631. They passed laws and went about their business all without any approval from the king. They regulated tobacco and had a fort built. Now, considering that this went on for most of a decade, I think we can safely assume that the king knew and didn't particularly object. More likely, Virginia was just a low priority for him. Remember, this is the decade where Charles tried to rule without calling any parliaments at all. Certainly the Assembly was confident enough to send petitions to the court without fear of reprisal. Not only that, the burgesses even assisted in the impeachment and removal of a governor, which I'll cover in more detail next time. However, I should re-emphasize that this story has been pieced together by historians looking at fairly fragmentary records. All we have to go on are whatever official documents happen to be preserved across the centuries. So while it appears that the Assembly was being called without official approval, in part that's just a presumption, based on the fact that we have no records of formal approval or acknowledgement. Absence of evidence is often the best we can do to show evidence of absence. And as I've been reading through the accounts of this period by various scholars, I often find them imposing their own, slightly different narratives on events. None of the differences are too drastic or too important for the overall story, but I think they're worth keeping in mind. I've done my best to synthesize what seems like the likeliest story, going back to primary sources themselves when necessary, but no doubt my own predispositions have worked their way in regardless. So that's where things stood in Virginia in the early 1630s. Life continued much as before, despite all the legal drama at the top. The colony continued to grow, though its population still numbered only in the thousands. Self-government existed in practice, if not in law. Virginia was developing its own political culture, a process that would accelerate over the next few decades as more immigrants streamed in. Virginia was becoming Virginia. I should also point out that the first settlers in New England, the Pilgrims, arrived in 1620, the year after the first General Assembly was called. We aren't going to get to New England for a little while, but you should keep in mind as we go forward that an almost totally separate story is playing out a few hundred miles to the north. However, next time, we'll stick to the Chesapeake and look at the creation of the colony of Maryland, Virginia's neighbor to the north, and how the early hostility between the two affected both sides. So join me next time for the thrusting out of Governor Harvey.